Helicopters with machine guns fired on rebel positions, according to witnesses. And in AlJazeera in eastern Libya, a standoff has developed between pro- and anti-Gaddafi forces. AlJazeera's Jackie Rowland has more.
The situation now in the east of the country is really a stalemate, with anti-Gaddafi forces either unable or unwilling to advance further towards the west and to try to take the fight closer to Gaddafi strongholds like Sirte and Tripoli. The pro-Gaddafi forces also seem unable or unwilling to do much more now apart from scrap against the rebel forces over a few towns in the deserts to the west of Benghazi. Now, when you look at the rebel forces, they're a rather undisciplined, unorderly bunch. Some of them will freely admit to having no military experience as recently as a week ago. And the weaponry they're using is a combination of old Soviet anti-aircraft guns and also some newer weaponry. But they are very undisciplined. They just seem to be letting off ammunition at the moment, wasting ammunition with no particular purpose. Now, this uprising that began a couple of weeks ago with such power and energy does appear to be losing momentum. And if anything right now, it looks as though the pro-Gaddafi forces have the upper hand.
Let's just bring you some pictures that are coming into us from Libyan state television. Crowds of pro-Gaddafi supporters waving flags and banners in Tripoli. And the reason we're keeping an eye on this for you is that state television in Libya quite often runs these kind of pictures before the leader, Muammar Gaddafi, comes on to speak. We know in the last few weeks he's spoken 3 times on television. Just a couple of days ago he spoke for nearly 3 hours to address his supporters. So there's a crowd that's been gathered there to show their support for Gaddafi on the day when there were further protests and confrontations between security forces and protesters in the heart of Tripoli, which were quite quickly clamped down on, according to correspondents we've spoken to. So just to give you an indication, that's why we're keeping an eye on those Libyan state television pictures for you. Of course, bring you more as soon as this turns into anything else. Right, some 180,000 foreign workers have streamed across Libya's borders during the unrest. The UN says more than 90,000 have fled to Tunisia and some 80,000 have crossed into Egypt. Another 2,500 have crossed at the Niger border. But while agencies are warning of a growing crisis for these refugees, thousands more are still stuck inside Libya. Bernard Smith reports.
Row after row of tents in this UN transit camp on the Tunisian side of the border with Libya. The site is already full. But the process of moving these people home has picked up. Throughout Friday, 40 flights will head to Cairo alone. Britain, France and the United States are providing aircraft to help the evacuation. The UN says that the number of refugees crossing into Tunisia has actually dropped significantly because the border there is now manned by heavily armed pro-Gaddafi forces. So almost all of Libya's neighbours could end up dealing with fleeing workers. Some have now fled through Algeria, further down Libya's western frontier. And up to 100,000 people may try to cross into Niger in the coming months. That's according to the UN. At Egypt's frontier with Libya, hundreds of African refugees are stranded in a border no man's land. Some have been there for days. Here, the Egyptian authorities have tightened security, fearing that mercenaries hired by Gaddafi may try to flee to Egypt. Bernard Smith, AlJazeera.
The US State Department has confirmed that humanitarian supplies have been delivered to Tunisia to help refugees who fled from Libya. This was spokesman PJ Crowley.
There is an international airlift in progress, which has significantly helped in easing the crisis caused by the influx of migrants into Tunisia. These C-130 aircraft today are carrying humanitarian supplies. We anticipate that tomorrow they will return and participate in the flow of migrants from Tunisia back to Egypt.
Well, on the line with us now from the Libya-Tunisia border is Ivan Gaigon, who's with the relief organisation Doctors Without Borders. Thank you very much indeed for being with us. Give us an indication of the situation where you are in terms of the humanitarian problems.
Well, we're here on the border with Tunisia and Libya, and our main interest is the wounded people within Libya. We hear reports from both our medical colleagues or counterparts on the Libyan side, as well as the refugees coming here into Tunisia. and we're hearing reports of massive numbers of war wounded. And we're ready here with capacity to go and treat those wounded, and we find that we're being blocked by Libyan authorities from getting and accessing those wounded people.
So, I mean, what kind of numbers do you think they're talking about there in terms of wounded people?
Well, we've spoken to some doctors in several of the areas that we're able to contact by telephone, and the people in the hospitals are talking about hundreds of woundeds. They're talking about hospitals that are overwhelmed in their capacity, running out of supplies, unable to provide transfusions, unable to provide basic care, and people are dying for lack of medical care.
And it is very much, as you suggest, the fact that the borders are closed and you're not being allowed to go in with extra help. Is that what you're saying?
Well, specifically, we've been requesting of the Libyan government and any interlocutor we can find within that country to allow us to go in and neutrally, impartially help the wounded and the sick. And we found that we're being blocked. We're not being given access, and we're being told that it's not appropriate for us to be in the country at the time.
And at the moment, are any of these people being brought to the borders, or are they too injured to travel?
We are finding that there are virtually no injured people coming through the border, and that, in fact, wounded people, not only are we prevented from going and treating the wounded people, but it seems as though the wounded people are not being allowed to access our care here on this side of the border.
And what about the people who have managed to leave? Are they generally in reasonable health?
Well, I have to point out the incredible effort by the Tunisian society here. We, Doctors Without Borders, are just absolutely astounded and impressed and moved by the outpouring of generosity by the Tunisian people. The people who are coming here are in reasonable shape, and they're being very well taken care of, and they're being received with an astonishing level of generosity by the Tunisians. We are very moved by this.
And there's also been, just in the last couple of hours or so, news from Washington that the State Department confirming that humanitarian supplies have been offloaded from a C-130 aircraft in Tunisia. How much difference will that make?
Well, the situation is a bit delicate here in Tunisia, simply because the sheer numbers of people that have been coming through. Numbers dropped a little bit in the last days. But if indeed there's a large influx, as much as the Tunisian authorities and as much as the Tunisian people and the United Nations system has been doing a good job of taking care of them, with the kinds of numbers that have been coming through, it'll be very difficult to treat their backlog. So these kinds of supplies are indeed important. The situation is reasonable. People are seeing reasonable care, but it's fragile.
OK, Ivan Gagon, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to talk to us. Thank you. Well, Libya is, of course, just one of a series of protests taking place across the Arab world. There's Egypt, focused on Cairo's Liberation Square. Protesters are calling for political reform. Tunisians in the south say the government in Tunis has been ignoring them. And in the Iraqi capital, Baghdad, thousands of demonstrators gathered at Tahrir Square. And at a rally in the Bahraini capital, Manama, religious leaders addressed a crowd of protesters. Both pro- and anti-government rallies were also held in Sana'a in Yemen. And across Oman on Friday, protesters called for an end to government corruption. In Jordan, opposition groups in Amman held a rally after Friday prayers. Well, Egypt's new Prime Minister has been welcomed as a guest of honour amongst protesters in Cairo's Tahrir Square. Issam Sharaf urged demonstrators